G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Those of you familiar with my channel will be well aware that I'm a bit of an aeroplane head. Those of you who have been paying attention for a long time to the aeroplane side of things may recall that I had a couple of ancestors, family members who were pilots in the First World War. One of them flew Sop with camels, that would be my father's uncle, and in the Second World War the camel jockey's son flew a tour of Lancasters in 1943, and then he came back to Australia and he converted to Catalinas, and he was operating out of Western Australia, and he was sort of flying to India and South Africa, Madagascar. So he went on and had a career in Qantas, but I didn't know much about that side of RAAF history. So when I saw this book in Badger's old books, I thought, oh, I'll grab that thing. It's only $10. Maybe I'll find out something about Alan Wharton, my second cousin. So I picked it up, and brief look in the shop taught me that it wasn't going to tell me much about Alan Wharton flying around in 1944-45 in Catalinas, because this was right at the start of the Pacific War. Hadn't ever read much about that either, so I bought the thing, and it's quite an interesting and unusual book. It's A3 format for a start, autographed. It's a first edition copy, probably an only edition copy, and the inscription is to the Mrs. Una Dan, who has helpfully bookmarked her relative. I don't know whether it was husband or brother or father or whatever it was, who was a second pilot aircrew. So this is fairly clearly a self-publication, what some people would call a vanity publication. The quality of the illustrations, which are in black and white, is pretty much what you'd expect for snapshots that are 70 years old. Oops, nearly 80 years old. This book is dedicated to the memory of Wing Commander Frank Chapman, DFC, its Distinguished Flying Cross, gentleman, pilot extraordinaire, posted missing on operations with crew in A2422 on the 8th of March 1943. Gentle with both men and machines, a legend in his own lifetime. About the author: I lived and fought alongside men the like of whom I shall never meet again. Jack Riddell, DFM, Distinguished Flying Medal, AEA, which I think is Aeronautical Engineering Association. May 1940, enlisted 2E RAAF, August 1940, number 6 Squadron, May 1941, number 2 Catalina Course Rathmines, August 1941 as flight engineer, crewed with Flight Lieutenant Frank Chapman on A24-6, proceeded to Port Moresby to form 20 Squadron. April 1943, returned to Rathmines to 3 OTU, Officer Training Unit, or Operational Training Unit. February 1944 to Ferry Flight and USA. May 1944 to 3 OTU Instructional Staff. August 1944, commissioned to GD, Flight Engineer, Ground Duties. January 45 to 111 ASRF at Madang, crewed First Engineer with CO Bill Miller and also Unit Engineering Officer. November 45 to 3 OTU, discharged June 1946, accumulated 2,300 flying hours, bombing attacks 32, operational flights 120. Preface by Group Captain Sir Richard Kingsland, AO, that's Order of Australia, CBE, Commander of the British Empire, DFC, Distinguished Flying Cross, an early commander of number 11 Squadron RAAF. About time, I say. About time that aircrew members other than pilots put pen to paper to tell us about the air war, such as the stories of the involvement of Catalinas in the Southwest Pacific in World War II. Their crews performed what must have been some of the most demanding tasks in the history of aviation. They say pigs might fly. This is no more unlikely than Australia depending on a handful of Catalinas designed for ocean reconnaissance for its very long-range strike and mine-laying force throughout the war. Members of Catalina crews welded themselves into unique teams. Each member was mutually dependent for his survival, each member an equal link in a chain to achieve operational efficiency. Their flying tasks were performed in very cramped conditions. This discomfort was multiplied by the flight endurance of the aircraft, anything up to 24 hours. Their ground duties performed in primitive conditions in tropical bases around the Pacific were no less difficult and stressful. This operational environment placed great demands on the perseverance of all crew members. What they lacked initially in experience in this cruel game, they made up for with courage and ingenuity. Night attacks by the slow, ungainly Catalinas on heavily defended targets and mine laying from minimal heights in enemy harbours were daunting risks for these young men. I knew of none that failed these trials. Jack Riddell's wartime service, which I saw in action, weaves through the story of these Catalinas. His name was a byword for cool, calm efficiency on difficult and dangerous missions and in the long hours of duty on ground. Who the better to recount Catalina history? Okay, we've got a lot to get through, and the illustrations are not great. I propose to come up here to the beginning of the war in this video. Happily, there are some pictorial pages. RAAF flying boat squadrons formed. At the outbreak of World War II, members of RAAF No. 10 Squadron were in England to take delivery of Sunderland flying boats, which were to go into service to patrol the eastern seaboard of Australia. However, after a request from the British government, the Australian government agreed to put this squadron at the disposal of the British, and subsequently the squadron was brought up to strength by sending more crews and ground staff from Australia. Wing Commander L.V. Lachel was commanding officer, and this squadron remained with the British on active service until hostilities ceased in Europe. It now became imperative that another squadron be given the task for which No. 10 was not available, and so in September 1939, No. 11 Squadron was formed. Its duties were to form a defensive patrol on the eastern seaboard of Australia as a reconnaissance squadron and was immediately sent to Port Moresby. Initially, the squadron was equipped with 2 amphibious Seagulls and 2 Qantas Empire short flying boats, and was under the command of Wing Commander J. Alexander. Early in June 1940, the Italian liner Romulo left Brisbane for Torres Strait with an Australian pilot aboard. Romulo was shadowed by HMAS Manura. On 9th of June, the pilot was taken off, and when Italy entered the war on the 10th of June, Manura was ordered to intercept and No. 11 Squadron to locate. Flight Lieutenant Simmons proceeded to Tulagi area but had no sightings. Tulagi being about here-ish, from what I can make out, because a lot of the political geography has changed. But that's kind of where we're talking about at this point in the story. Manura caught up with Romulo by the 12th of June. Just in time to see the ship set alight and abandoned by the crew. Instead of a nice fat ship, we only had lifeboats full of Italian merchant navy. On Christmas Day 1940, survivors totalling 469 had been located on Emaru Island, almost on the equator. They had been marooned by a German raider. There were 7 ship's captains with crews and passengers. A flying boat from No. 11 Squadron picked up the captains and took them to Townsville for questioning. The liner Nellore was sent to collect the remainder. These 2 incidents confirmed the need for No. 11 Squadron patrols and that there were not sufficient aircraft to cater for the urgent need. No. 11 Squadron was equipped with Catalinas as they became available. A total of 168 Catalina flying boats were eventually brought into service by the RAAF. The original order was for 18 aircraft, First delivery was March 1941 and completed by October the same year. The next 12 were delivered between March and July 1942. The Catalina flying boat was American designed. It was built and used by the American Navy as a patrol bomber. Here's a picture of an amphibious model that's had an engine failure on Loch Ness and it's being craned off the water. It was built and used by the American Navy as a patrol bomber with a wingspan of 104 feet. The Catalina hull length was 65 feet. The height of the tail and rudder was over 18 feet. It was powered by two Pratt & Whitney twin-row radial engines, each of 1,200 horsepower. Weight on takeoff was 35,500 pounds, including 1,460 gallons of petrol, 4,000 pounds of bombs, 6 machine guns, ammunition, and a crew of 8. The crews consisted of captain, second pilot, first engineer, second engineer, first wireless telegrapher, second wireless telegrapher, rigger and armourer. Crews were increased to 9 in March 1942 with the addition of a navigator to the crew. The first engineer was the crew chief and was directly responsible to the captain for the serviceability of the aircraft and all other matters related to the organising of the crew. Duties included setting of guards, arranging shifts when operating from anchorages where wireless facilities did not exist. Even when the crews were changed, the first engineer remained with the aircraft. The first 18 aircraft had their guns fitted on arrival in Australia. These guns were 1917 model Lewis guns, surplus from World War I stocks, with 99-round magazines for each gun. The next 12 came equipped with American-made Browning gas-operated guns. Later orders came with .5-inch cannons in each blister. With 7 compartments, the bow compartment was used by the forward gunner and the second wireless telegrapher, the bomber and the bomb aimer. The next was the pilot's compartment, the navigators and wireless telegraphers compartment, and the engineer's compartment with 2-burner electric hot plate and auxiliary power unit. The bunk compartment had 4 double-decker bunks. The blister compartment carried a pair of twin guns mounted by rigger and armourer. Finally, the tunnel compartment with 1 gun mounted by the second engineer. That tunnel gun fires directly backwards under the tail. 4 bulkhead doors were fitted. In the event of any damage below the waterline, these doors could be closed off to isolate problem areas. Normal operation permitted flying in excess of 20 hours over a distance of 2,000 miles or more. The original captains came from Qantas and other commercial airlines, and from the captains of the amphibious Seagulls, which were used as spotting and scouting planes from Royal Australian Navy cruisers. Second pilots came from wartime aircrew enlistments, and after successful flying training at RAAF flying schools, were posted to number 11 Squadron. Navigators from the same source were added in 1942. The balance of the crew, first and second engineers, first and second wireless telegraph operators, rigger air gunner and armourer air gunner were all drawn from RAAF ground staff. These people were posted to seaplane training flight at Rathmines on Lake Macquarie, New South Wales, and were given a 5-week course familiarising themselves with the aircraft both in their trade area and others, becoming multi-skilled ready for any job that may arise. Seamanship and gunnery training was also included. After 5 weeks, these people were put into crews or allocated for duty in Port Moresby. Everyone on these courses completed an air-to-air gunnery course with a minimum firing of 200 rounds from the Catalina blister guns at a canvas drogue which was towed by a seagull. Each gunner used bullets dipped in a paint of a colour allocated to each gunner. After the drogue had been dropped on the Rathmines parade ground, a count was made of the quantity and colour of the bullet holes in the drogue. Veteran flyer Scotty G.U. Allen, ex-Qantas, was originally in charge of the training flight, ably assisted by Bill Richmond, Jock Tennant and George Bembrose, ex-number 10 Squadron, who had returned from England via America as Catalina ferry crews. As America was not then in the war, these people were discharged from the RAAF and entered the United States as civilians, but immediately re-engaged when they arrived home. Numbered with the prefix A24, The first Catalina A24-1 was retained at Rathmines as a training aircraft. By August 1941 at Port Moresby, A24-2, A24-3, A24-4 and A24-5 were allocated to number 11 Squadron. On 7th of August 1941, Catalina A24-6, captained by Frank Chapman, arrived in Port Moresby and became the first aircraft to form number 20 Squadron. Frank Chapman became the commanding officer A Flight. The combination of men and machines from number 11 and number 20 squadrons was so interlocked that as need arose, combinations of crews and aircraft continued until well into 1943. Oops, wrong photo, out of sequence. Try that. Port Moresby's wharf area, 1941. Catalina bases. At Port Moresby, all the squadron members except officers lived in Tin City at Coney Doby, a collection of galvanised iron shearer-type huts built on wooden piers on the side of a hill about a mile west of the aircraft servicing area. Accommodation was given to the crews upon arrival, and often a crew would be split between 2 or 3 huts intermingled with ground crew. This arrangement promoted great friendships between the crews and the ground staff, and in most cases continuing friendships. This arrangement greatly enhanced the cooperation between all squadron members. With number 11 and number 20 squadrons having their headquarters at Port Moresby, they also shared advanced operational bases, AOB, at Rabaul, Tulagi, Vila and Nemea. So that's Rabaul as an operational base from Port Moresby as their main base. Down here in Nemea, Vila in Vanuatu, and Tulagi at Guadalcanal. So from here, they were spread pretty thin. 5 Catalina flying boats. These bases had accommodation, food, fuel barges, and wireless telegraphy services, while anchorages were available at Manus, Caving, Sorokin Plantation, Samurai, Salamua, and Thursday Island with limited facilities. Many of these places were to become like second homes to some of the early crews. The Rabaul base consisted of a very large fibro building on the edge of the water on Simpson Harbour with a long jetty. This base had cooks, wireless telegraph, ground operators, and a very large marine section with petrol barge, bomb scow and runabouts. 2 nationals named Ephraim, brackets, corrupted to airframe, and Bolton were part of the strength of this AOB and assisted with food preparation, tidying, laundry for the troops, and generally were most helpful and useful. They were both mission trained, could read and write, and at all times had a happy disposition. Bit of colonial rose-coloured glasses there, maybe, perhaps. Officers stayed at the Cosmopolitan Hotel, one of the 3 hotels in Rabaul. This hotel had a rare air conditioning device in the dining room. It consisted of several flat rectangular light wooded frames hinged to the ceiling for the width of the room and operated by a rope pulled by a national through the wall to the outside of the hotel. If the room became too hot, Mrs. Gaskin, the publican's wife, with a few well-directed words, would energise the rope puller. This equipment was called a punkah, Indian device, as far as I know. Rabaul AOB did not have any transport. Everything required was delivered. If RAAF members needed to go to town a distance of over 1 mile, a telephone call to the local taxi service would bring a taxi driven by a national. The account was signed by the user and paid by the RAAF. All taxi cabs had the front guards missing due to deposits of volcanic dust which built up on the area between the car and the guards. Mixed with rainwater caused a high rate of corrosion. Often, if the crews had some spare time, they would go to the Chinatown shops in Rabaul, where they could buy tailor-made shirt and shorts for 5 shillings each. Sometimes the Chinese storekeeper would parade one of his beautiful daughters as a mannequin, displaying kimonos or blouses which were bought for girlfriends. Unfortunately, many days Rabaul was covered with a fine pumice ash from the volcano at Matupi. Crews needed to keep covers on the engines, blisters and pilots' windows for protection. It was necessary to wear goggles to protect their eyes and sometimes needed 3 or 4 changes of clothing each day. Malaria and dermatitis were prevalent among the RAAF people. It was virtually impossible to guard against both. Often many RAAF bodies were covered with green or purple dye to treat the skin diseases. The Tulagi base in the British Solomon Islands was situated on a small island called Gavutu, joined by a causeway to Tanambogo Island. Both islands would have a total area of approximately 10 acres. The base had huts with verandas for sleeping and a mess building for preparation and eating meals. Nearby there was a diesel generating plant providing round-the-clock cover for the operation of the transmitting and receiving of signals, light and power for accommodation. A fuel barge provided petrol to the aircraft tanks. A bomb scour was available for use when required. An assortment of boats provided service between the jetty and the flying boat moorings. Baked beans, spaghetti, bully beef, tinned fish and dehydrated potatoes made up the normal army rations and were supplemented by fish from the marine section, pawpaws from their own trees, fresh beef and goat meat from shooting expeditions at Guadalcanal, a plentiful supply of yams and other vegetables from the native villages. Although there was plenty of fresh water from the tanks, there was no pressure supply available for the buildings. A shower required a bucket, a rope and a pulley over the shower with a quick release lever through a shower rose. It was best if this was done in pairs. Bombs were stored under the palm trees adjacent to the jetty. Later, on the instructions of the visiting RAAF armament officer, a tunnel was dug into the side of the hill for a bomb dump over a period of a few weeks. The tunnel proved to be a first-class air raid shelter when the Japanese stepped up their bombing attacks. Gavutu was approximately 5 miles by sea from the town of Tulagi. And Tulagi was the capital of the British Solomon Islands. Tulagi boasted the Tulagi Club, the post office, and shops operated by Lever Brothers, steamship trading company, Burns Philp, and the headquarters of the police department. National members of the police force enjoyed saluting anyone in uniform. RAAF members were expected to return all such salutes. Kavieng, capital of New Ireland, had several flying boat moorings. Meals and accommodation were available at the Kavieng Club. This accommodation was not for rent, but was made available by the courtesy of the club and its members. It was greatly appreciated by the crews. The dining room had a very large round table with a beaten silver edge. On this edge, the names of the club members were engraved. Kavieng was also the headquarters of the 2nd 1st Australian Imperial Force Commandos, also known as the Double Diamonds because of the shape of their colour patches and the first independent company. They had small detachments spread around the various islands. At Gavutu, they had 25 men and an officer. There was a larger detachment at Buka. With their forces spread so thinly, it was a pleasure for the Catalinas to bring mail to the commandos. The lifeblood for a Catalina was petrol. This was available in 44-gallon drums under the palm trees adjacent to the wharf. To use the fuel, it had to be rolled down to the jetty and either taken out one at a time in a dinghy, or if the weather was kind and the water calm, a raft made from 4 empty fuel drums was loaded with 2 full drums and towed out by dinghy. It was a matter of pride that the refuelling was always done by the crew. Kavieng was powered by a diesel generator. It was closed down at 2200 hours each night, that's 10 p.m. Lighting was then supplied by batteries at the powerhouse. A boat building and repair slipway with half-caste tradesmen was also available and only used when necessary. At Manus, in the Admiralty Islands, there we go, Manus Island, 79 years ago. At Manus in the Admiralty Islands was an army post with 10 commandos and an officer, Lieutenant Palmer. They were encamped alongside the landing strip, which was just long enough to handle a Lockheed Hudson. Petrol again had to be moved in the drums out by dinghy to the aircraft and pumped up by a semi-rotary hand-operated pump into the aircraft tanks. Living arrangements were basic. Overnight accommodation was in tents. Showers were taken under a small diverted waterfall. Food came from aircraft ration lockers. Lighting was by kerosene lamp. Sarakan Plantation, belonging to the Lever brothers, had several boat moorings. It was managed by Rolf Cambridge, later to become a coast watcher. Rolf made the verandas of his manager's house available with beds for the use of the Catalina crews. It was necessary for crews at this anchorage to arrange their own wireless telegraph schedules with Port Moresby, usually every 2 hours during the night. At least 3 of the crew would need to be awake on the aircraft to handle radio traffic, to decode and encode, to row the dinghy ashore to take radio messages to the captain, who was quartered at Rolf's house. In the main, the crews lived off their own rations, but Rolf made sure they were well supplied with bananas, pineapples and pawpaws from the plantation garden. The petrol problem, like caving and Manus, continued to contribute to the almost sheer exhaustion from which the crews suffered under these conditions. Villa in the New Hebrides was an AOB with excellent facilities. It was well sited, high and dry, with airy buildings, officers' mess, operations and radio room, cookhouse, stores, other ranks, mess and barracks, similar to Gavutu. Large shady mango trees completed the picture. Jack Anderson was the stores clerk and Moby Dick Pascoe was in the marine section. Nationals worked at the AOB. They were very clean, good teeth, spoke French and English, and dressed in European clothes. The brighter the better. The alighting area for Catalinas was approached from the open sea, and after touchdown, just inside the harbour entrance, the Catalinas taxied into a secluded deep water lagoon behind an island in the harbour proper. How's that? A really nice map of the anchorages at Nemea relative to the town. Returning to the text, the alighting area for Catalinas was approached from the open sea, and after touchdown just inside the harbour entrance, the Catalinas taxied to a secluded deep water lagoon behind an island in the harbour proper. This middle island was the domain of the French administrator and was joined to the main island by shallow coral reefs guarding the approaches to the Catalina anchorage in the lagoon. A channel had been blown through the coral reef on the sheltered side of the island. Channel markers erected on the main island guided Catalinas and fuel barge when entering. When leaving the anchorage, someone in the blister had to guide the captain by lining up the markers and calling instructions as needed. The AOB armourer kept a check on the coral niggerheads popping up in the channel and blew them off, but they still grew like mushrooms. Vila had good drinking water from the frequent rain. Crews calling at Vila always left with Vila waters in their tanks. The showers were similar to the Gavutu models. Showering in pairs was still the most practical. Crews would swim at the Malakula beach, but it was important that only one of each trade group went at a time. If the need arose to move the aircraft and both engineers were swimming, it would have been a disaster. On November 6, 1941, A2410, captained by Flight Lieutenant Keith Caldwell, arrived in Vila with Tubby Higgins, second pilot, Jack Dewhurst, first engineer, Vic Knowles, second engineer, Bernie Hart, second wireless telegrapher, George McMaster, first wireless telegrapher, Alex McDonald, armourer, Vince Kavanagh, 2A, and Alec Briggs, WEM. The next day, Keith Caldwell obtained a truck to take his crew around the island, showing off its cocoa, coffee and tea plantations. The AOB was some distance from the town. From the air, Vila looked like any other Pacific island. On the ground, it was obvious it had very rich volcanic soil. Fruit and vegetables were grown commercially as well as in the native gardens. To replenish their food stocks, the crews traded with the village gardeners for pawpaws, mangoes, bananas, limes, tomatoes, soursops, yams, cabbage, beetroot and chocos. There were coconut trees here and there, but copra was produced elsewhere and could be smelt on the wharf where it was held awaiting shipment. On the wharf was a very large shed with a painted roof. On it were the letters CFNH in white paint. It was called the Can't Find Nothing Here shed, with many variations on the letter F. At night, this shed was almost as good as a beacon, especially in squally weather, as it could be picked out with the Catalina landing lights. The island also boasted a substantial hospital. Strangely, when WEM WEM Jack Connolly developed appendicitis. The RAAF doctor came from Port Moresby on the longest house call in the southwest Pacific area. He was taken back to Moresby for the operation and convalescence, then posted to Nemea. Jack is still trying to find out what he did wrong to miss out on having the beautiful French nurses caring for him at Vila Hospital. The crews had little to do with the French nationals, but the AOB staff got on well with them. Waterfront businesses, French and Chinese merchants, filled the town. One day in town, Keith Caldwell's crew found a barber. There were haircuts all around. The barber had never seen so many clients at any one time. It was observed that this barber had a great number of mirrors installed in his shop, so that where he stood behind the chair, he could see everything that moved on the road and the sea. After Pearl Harbour, this barber was relocated to an internment camp. During A2410's stay in Vila, a Japanese ship berthed. Groups of Japanese, quote, tourists, end quote, openly took photos of this and that roaming at will. No doubt, A2410 and its crew featured in Japanese naval intelligence file after the visit. I've got to say, every nation that participated in World War II did this with all of its citizens as soon as they came home from every overseas trip. If you went to a potentially antagonistic or possibly enemy country, when you came back, you were contacted and asked, did you take any photographs? Can we have a look at them? Pretty please. Can we make copies of them? Can we keep the original negatives? It was not at all unusual for the Japanese to have done this with their civilian tourists. I really find it bordering on pathetic the way it was portrayed as particularly nefarious, wicked, evil, cunning, sly, devious, dirty, and underhanded for the Japanese and the German tourists to have done exactly what the Australians and the British and the Americans, the French, the Belgians, the Dutch, all tourists in the late 1930s, all of them were asked, what photos have you got when they came back from overseas trips? Oh, sorry, just had to sort of get that one off the chest. Just chalk it up to almost 80 years worth of accumulated hindsight, and I've been thinking about it for probably 50 of those years. Often at night, the natives paddled canoes to and from the AOB. They sang all the way across the harbour and were answered by the women folk at the villages. This was their navigational aid. The singing was repetitive but catchy, like a choir, and a soloist at a concert. This crew was in Vila again on Christmas Eve, 1941, and the singing on that night was extra special when they sang Silent Night in both French and English, and then their own Moto Boo. The crew felt privileged to have witnessed this Christmas performance. Just prior to Christmas, with Flight Lieutenant Bob Thompson, Flight Lieutenant Paul Metzler, A2410's crew was bound for Nemea. Flying Officer Mason arranged with the crew to ferry 2 turkeys to the officer in charge at Nemea with his compliments. 2 corn sacks, each containing a turkey, were stowed in the tunnel for the trip. After takeoff, when Metzler came aft for his morning pee, a turkey stuck his head out the hole in the bag and went gobble, gobble, gobble. Metzler was coming out of the tunnel and said to Vince Kavanagh, there's a turkey in the tunnel. Kavanagh replied, correction, sir, there are 2 turkeys in the tunnel. Whilst A2410 was stationed at Vila, 6 American Catalinas stayed for the night. They were headed for Perth via Moresby, Darwin and Broome. When the American crews visited A2410, crews exchanged views and technical data. Australian instructions had pilots raise the floats as soon as the aircraft was on the step. The Americans were ordered not to raise the floats until well and truly airborne. Leave the floats down, one of them gets hit by a wave when you're at high water speed, not enough air speed to fly, you could yaw, roll the opposite way, dig the other float in, cartwheel, wrap it up in a ball. I think I prefer the Australian instructions, actually. Not that I've ever flown anything off water. strikes me that after you crash, it's bad enough without having to try not to drown afterwards. Other visitors for this crew included 2 short Singapore flying boats from the Royal Air Force in Singapore bound for New Zealand. When these aircraft had passed through Moresby, the RAAF lent them Andy Kelso, WEM, to advise their, that's probably wireless engineer mechanic, I guess, I don't know, to advise their WT, wireless telegraphist, on the local transmissions. They were conveyed by Catalina from Moresby to Tulagi to Vila and then proceeded to Fiji. The crews visited each other and parted with well-meant feelings of good luck all round. After leaving the near-paradise conditions of Vila on the 15th of November 1941, the A2410 crew found themselves on Nemea. Nemea was very similar to Port Moresby, barren-looking hills, hot, dry, dusty, and nowhere near as clean and tidy as Vila. Nemea had a large, well-sheltered harbour containing a big island. The AOB was established on the island, which in the past had guillotines on several hilltops, and in the future would provide excellent anchorages for the American fleets. Locals referred to this island as Devil's Island. It even boasted a prison. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese, interned by the local authorities, were imprisoned there and were exercised along the foreshore in front of the AOB in full view of the harbour, its shipping and the flying boat's moorings. The day before A2410 arrived, the only Marine Section worker, Lance Borgley, was severely burned while cleaning a fuel barge. Apparently he saved the barge from disaster with much discomfort to himself. He recovered in hospital. The 2 engineers, Jack Dewhurst and Vic Knowles, assisted by 2nd 2A air gunner, aircraftman 2nd class air gunner Vince Kavanagh. Deciphering this stuff's getting a bit tricky. Spent the next morning checking over the barge. Things worked. By midday, they felt confident they could handle the refuelling of A2410. The engine was started and the barge moved away from the jetty, clear of the aircraft. They did a bit of forward and reverse, going alongside the jetty and reversing up to a vacant aircraft mooring buoy. Eventually, the barge was reversed up to A2410 mooring, while Jack Dewhurst acted as coxswain. Vic Knowles looked after the hoses. Vince Kavanagh stood by with a fire extinguisher and kept an eye on the moorings. Refuelling was completed satisfactorily. At this time, the barge was the only powered boat there and was used to run from the AOB to Nemea for supplies. Later, Moby Dick Pascoe replaced Lance Bagley, and a crash boat was delivered from Halvorsens, Sydney. Keith Caldwell, as a flying boat captain of long standing and in line with other captains' customs, took the opportunity while the aircraft was moored in smooth waters to give each of the crew sail the cat practice. The aircraft had the harbour to itself. The harbour was clean, no coconut trees or rubbish to smash the hull on takeoff and landings, ideal for cat sailing. This was an important skill to be acquired by the crews in the event of an anchor or engine failure. This skill could salvage an aircraft while the engines were started. It even allowed easy mooring in a crowded anchorage. When the aircraft reached the harbour entrance, the engines were started and each crew member had a turn at taxiing on the water. Keith Caldwell also had the crew practice international code flags, semaphore and Morse code signals. At the AOB, there was a meteorological officer, OC, I guess that's officer commanding. Probably it should be meteorological officer commanding. A Met NCO, a stores clerk, Cherub-Sellers, must be the name of him, a cook, wireless telegraphers and WEMs. There were separate buildings for eating and sleeping with an excellent high-pressure fresh water supply. This water was from a concrete tank set high on the hill adjacent to the AOB. Nemea itself maintained a siesta from 11 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock in the afternoon when not even a dog stirred. Shopping was a nightmare because of the language difficulties. Even to buy meat, it was necessary to have the butcher roll out the carcasses from the cool room so we could select the cuts we required. What hardships! Fish, fruit and vegetables were plentiful and cheap in the shops. The orchards and farms were quite a distance from town. AOB Circuit. A24-2 Captain Bob Gurney led the first of the Catalina crews to number 11 Squadron at Port Moresby, arriving on the 13th of May 1941. Now, bear in mind that as well as bases along here, we've also discussed bases out here on Fiji, Wallis Island, Tuvalu. These blokes got around. In the next 6 months, A24-2 travelled throughout the southwest Pacific area and made landfall at many places. The original crew was Bob Gurney, second pilot Alan Norman, first engineer Jack Wish, second engineer Harry Hornby, first wireless telegraphist Smoky Gordon Dawson, second WT Errol Mosser, third WT George McMaster, rigger Ron Pryor and armourer Ken Aitkenhead. Bob Gurney was an ex-British Empire Airways pilot and also number 11 Squadron Sunderland captain. Was admirably qualified and experienced for the task before him, as he was to visit all the AOB sites and many other places. He was to be accompanied to many of these places by Lieutenant Commander Eric Felt, F-E-L-D-T, who was very quietly and efficiently laying the foundations for the Coast Watchers organisation, which he was to operate from Cairns after the Japanese ended the war. Landings were made at Rabaul, Caveen, Gizo, Vanikora, Farsi, Carola Haven, Sorokin, Samarai, Thursday Island, Gavutu, Vila, Nemea and Suva. Rabaul was the only AOB in operation at this time. Everywhere else, accommodation was obtained from available sources, with pilots mainly living ashore while crew survived on the aircraft. Wireless communications were very important. Quite often the aircraft was used as a transmitter and receiver. Where radio facilities existed, the WT on the crew would take shifts at these civil facilities. Hence the reason for 3 WTs. On 24 November 1941, George McMaster, ex-A24-2, arrived back at Rathmines with the crew of A24-10. He had been away for 6 months continuous crew duty. The crew was sent on leave and George McMaster made great haste to travel to Melbourne, where he married. He returned to Rathmines in time to crew on A24-10 on the 2nd of December and was to return to Vila on the 4th of December with new pilots Captain Bob Thompson and second pilot Paul Metzler. Working out of Nemea over the next few days with Metzler, Bob Thompson proved his skill as navigator, flying from first light to last, always on time. During this time, George, the automatic pilot, went on the blink. All the crew took turns at the controls, hand flying the Catalina. Aircraft A24-3, A24-4 and A24-5 left Rathmines progressively from May 1941 for Moresby, having been used for general training exercises. With the arrival of A24-6 Frank Chapman at Moresby, the aircraft was injected into the flying boat Outer Perimeter Defence line bases. After several days practicing circuits, landing and photography, the aircraft proceeded to Salamua through the gap in the Owen Stanley Ranges on the 11th of August. After half an hour ashore, it took off for the AOB at Rabaul for a short time, taking more short flights and photographs of the area. The crew lived at the AOB with beds available around the verandas formed on all sides of the building, while the 2 pilots stayed at the Cosmopolitan Hotel. On the morning of 18 August, the crew went out after breakfast to check the aircraft. After unlocking the blisters and going aboard, a strong smell of petrol indicated something was wrong. There were 9 inches of petrol in the bilge. The engineer arranged for the petrol barge to come alongside when the crew drained the tanks, called a taxi and went to the hotel to advise the captain, who was still having breakfast. The leak was at the flange between the top and the bottom of the tanks on both sides. It was repaired with yellow litharge and glycerine. Added to the corking cotton, the mixture was corked into the joints. After 24 hours allowed setting and curing, the tanks were refilled and found to be satisfactory. On the 21st of August, A24-6 left Rabaul, called into Caveen and Samarai, where the crew stayed the night. Dinner was provided by the mission and some of the crew stayed on board. The rest went ashore and stayed the night. The mission really looked after the crew. Next day saw them back in Moresby. After a trip to Rabaul on 28 August, a decision was made to return this aircraft to Rathmines the next day via Townsville for a complete petrol tank repair. If the Japanese were to come into the war, all aircraft should be in top condition. On 2 September, this crew with replacement aircraft A247 left Rathmines, stopped overnight at Townsville and then on to Port Moresby. 3 days later, they were in Rabaul. Then on 10 September, the aircraft went to Caving. During the Rabaul stopover, a telephone call was received from the Australian Imperial Forces Sergeants' Mess at Kokopo for all RAAF sergeants to attend the opening of the new Sergeants' Mess. When it was established that there were no RAAF sergeants because of the shoestring budget for the operation, the corporals were invited. A riotous time was had by all. At Caving, a sports day was organised between the RAAF and the Commandos. It was really a type of decathlon where opposing teams had to swim underwater, run 100 yards, hit a golf ball the furthest, jump a hop, step and jump. Amazingly, the RAAF won the competition, thanks to the athletic prowess of Frank Chapman, who virtually won the contest on his own. On 14 September, A247 moved to Gavutu with a stop at Buka Passage to deliver mail to the commandos there. The aircraft was engaged in reconnaissance out of Gavutu until 6 October when it returned to Moresby. While on Gavutu, Frank Chapman spent many hours at the navigator's table, plotting details on how to raid the Japanese base at Truk in the Caroline Islands, should the Japanese enter the war. Little did he know that 2 months later the Japs would attack Pearl Harbour. At Moresby, A247 was flown by Squadron Leader T.M. Price, Squadron Leader Hoot Gibson and Flight Lieutenant Frank Chapman on flying and bombing practice. On 11 October, Chapman travelled to Rathmines as a passenger on a Sunderland to assist the training of more captains and crews. Flight Lieutenant Charles Thompson took over A247 on the 27th of October. Until mid-November, he used the aircraft to practice takeoffs and landings and bombings. Concern was growing with the future movements of the Japanese fleet. A247 was to operate from Rabaul, Caving and Sorokin Plantation to search for the Japanese. The operation continued until 4 January 1942. This operation involved many long flights over the equator. On search days, the aircraft took off at first light and returned at last light. For reference, that's the equator there. There's your Caroline Islands, Truck's up there somewhere, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and there's the equator along there. So these blokes are taking off from here and going out there looking for Japanese fleets. The crew had a £1 sweepstake. It's roughly $2, $2.20. Winner take all to go to the first crew member to sight the Japanese. The prize, fortunately, was never won. After landing at Rabaul on the 8th of December at 1600 hours, 4 p.m, it took a very long time for the Marine section to put out a boat to collect the crew. When they arrived, they'd been busy digging slit trenches as protection against the Japanese air raids. The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbour that morning. America was at war. This gave the crew much to ponder, especially when they had spent the day looking for the Japanese. Nobody had thought of advising A247 of the attack. The captain had a beautiful Air Force type moustache, so the other 7 crew members decided to grow moustaches during this period. The only one worth keeping was grown by Bob Hurst, second pilot, and he kept it for life. The other crew members finally had a good shave at Moresby. While operating from the Sorokin plantation, the manager, Rolf Cambridge, happened to have barbering skills, offered haircuts for everyone. The crew was happy to lose some hair. When overnighting at Rabaul, the crew would tune into the Japanese radio and listen to Tokyo Rose, who spoke in English to both Americans and Australians, threatening them with Japanese action still to come. It was a sobering announcement when, in early January, Radio Manila said they were closing down for the duration. They were only just up the track from Rabaul. On 4th of January 1942, A247 left Rabaul for Moresby, stopping at Samarai on the way. By leaving then, they missed the first Japanese air raid carried out by 22 aircraft on Rabaul. While A24-7 was engaged for 7 weeks at the Rabaul Caving Sarakan Triangle, the balance of the first order for 18 Catalinas had been delivered. The squadron's strengths had been increased with the addition of new aircraft. 2 Americans, Lieutenant Weller and Lieutenant Hutchison, joined as captains, along with Flight Lieutenant E. Beaumont, Flight Lieutenant R. Thompson, Flight Lieutenant L. Sloan, and Second Lieutenant L.T. Davis. The other activities at the time included the search for HMAS Sydney by 2 Catalinas under the command of Squadron Leader Hoot Gibson. There, that SL's Squadron Leader, not Second Lieutenant. Squadron Leader Hoot Gibson and Lieutenant Hutchison, who had proceeded urgently to Fremantle from Moresby on the 25th of November 1941. Okay, so they went from Port Moresby over there to Fremantle in Western Australia to go looking for the HMAS Sydney. Dividers set on 500 miles. 500, almost 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 2,500, 3,000, damn near 4,000 miles. Yeah, long way to go over what you'd call bloody nowhere country in a twin-engine flying boat. Other RAAF aircraft in the search were Lockheed Hudsons from number 14 and number 25 squadrons and Avro Ansons from RAAF training school at Geraldton. HMAS Sydney had been sunk by the German raider Cormoran. After the action, the raider blew up and the crew took to their lifeboats. No survivors were ever found from the Sydney, but approximately 100 were recovered from the Cormoran lifeboats. On 4 December, A2410, captained by Flight Lieutenant Thompson, arrived back at Vila after an overhaul at Rathmines, undertook reconnaissance flights out from Vila, Gavutu, Nemea and Suva during December and January. 2 days later, a reconnaissance flight was made to Suva, returning on the 8th of December. Over the next 4 days, this aircraft, flying from first light to dusk, searched for the enemy. On the 8th of December, A2415 with Captain Flight Lieutenant Lynn Sloan was lost with all of the crew when the aircraft crashed shortly after takeoff into a hill on the western side of Port Moresby. The crew was buried in the war cemetery in Port Moresby. A2410 moved to Gavutu on the 16th of December. Over the next 3 days, they continued to fly dawn to dusk searches and returned to Vila on the 22nd of December. By the end of the month, they were back in Nemea after 152 hours of flying time, having travelled from Rathmines to Brisbane, then Vila, Suva, Gavutu and Nemea. A2410 returned to Suva on the 3rd of January. After searching around the Nemea area, the aircraft flew to Moresby, completing 12 hours flying time on the 15th of January, where changes were made to the crew. And the next title on my manuscript is The War Begins. So I reckon that's a pretty good innings. Call it 8 pages of A3. So let's just say herewith the end of part 1. 1939 to January 1942. And didn't Jack Riddell do a bloody good job at making sure that this history is not forgotten? And what we've done now is set the scene for the Battle of the Coral Sea, which we'll deal with in subsequent videos, because I can't see that I'm going to finish this in another single video, so there'll be at least another 2. Warbles on like the YouTube. Ciao.